So it's almost an impossible task, I'm afraid, to report upon the entirety of UNICEF's work in education across 157 different countries in slightly over 10 minutes. So you will be getting some very scant highlights in the next 10 minutes from me, and hopefully that will give you some space to then ask any more detailed questions. Obviously there's a much bigger report that sits underneath this. But before I start, just a quick thank you to members of my team who are here. They might want to give a little wave, all of whom have contributed to the overall report, but more substantively, all of whom know an awful lot of detail about particular areas that may be of interest to you. So when it comes to the questions, they're here to help out. I'm going to do very quickly on context, of course. We're now well into the beginning of the Sustainable Development Goals, and with a particular goal around education, which is both broader in terms of scope than the SDGs, but also has a very strong focus running throughout on equity and on learning. We have a number of amount of progress that's been made, particularly with regards to the MDGs around primary and gender parity in primary, although this does mask some differences across countries. And then perhaps one of the most important things that happened last year was the launch of the Education Commission's report, The Learning Generation. And if anyone is interested in education, do read it. And one of the things we did in this year's report was actually reflect a little bit on some of the lessons coming out from the learning generation with regards to UNICEF's own programming, i.e. are we operating in the right place in terms of our priorities. As you'll probably know, there are still challenges. One of those has to be, of course, the number of children that have their education disrupted by crisis. 75 million children estimated from 35 countries, and that children who are in conflict-affected countries more than twice as likely to be out of school. So this remains a huge priority, and it's really great actually that education in emergencies is now being recognised by a number of partners as something that has been lagging in terms of attention, and now much more attention has been given to that. Still, globally, we have issues around access. It's worth just sort of pausing here, and I'll mention this later. Essentially, out-of-school numbers are stagnating. Now, of course, people still keep having children, so the number of children that are around is growing, and the number of children who are being enrolled in primary schools and other schools is growing. However, it's not growing fast enough in order to really make a significant impact at the moment on out-of-school children. So what we know, of course, is when it comes to out-of-school children, it's the marginalised that are the hardest to reach. It's worth pausing here, of course, because when we think about the SDG, we are now talking about both children and adolescents in terms of their schooling. What we see, of course, is that secondary and adolescence are not necessarily the same thing. And we've started looking at where are the most marginalised adolescents in many of the countries where we're working, the 10 to 19-year-olds. And what we see across all the different analyses is that in many countries, the adolescents are either never entered primary school in the first place, or they have entered primary school and dropped out, or they are still in primary school. So adolescents are still in primary school. And as they get further up through the education system, the marginalised adolescents are increasingly less likely to be represented in those higher levels of education. So something we've been looking at very much is, well, how do we help support today's adolescents to have pathways back into education through things like second chance education, non-formal education, as well as making sure that education systems themselves are able to take marginalised children and adolescents all the way through the system. So those are important factors to take into account as we look forward. We also know, of course, and I mentioned a second ago, that we have a demographic challenge. This little graph shows girls in and out of school in Western and Central Africa, aged 3 to 15-year-olds, and it's showing that by 2030, projections, those numbers of girls are projected to double. So it gives you an idea of the challenge that we have ahead still. We also know, and we've talked about this before, that even if you go to school, you don't necessarily learn. And we instead of using the 250 million children who reach the age of grade 4 not being able to read the basics, because you all know that. We've borrowed a different statistic this time from the Education Commission, estimating that 69% of children in low-income countries are not expected to learn basic primary level skills by 2030. So just thinking about our focus on equity and learning, giving you a sense of what the challenge is moving forward. So looking backwards now in terms of the UNICEF Strategic Plan and what we did in 2016, I think you probably know most of this, so I'm not going to go through it. We have a number of priority program areas under the current strategic plan for education, and then we report against 3 different levels: outputs, outcomes, and impact, with different levels of attribution and contribution against all of those. So, a more direct area, the thing that's easier to measure, it's not that easy to measure, but it's easier to measure, is some of the numbers in terms of learning materials, in terms of classrooms supported, in terms of schools and communities that have, school communities that have been trained, and in terms of the number of children that have been reached with education in emergencies. And that number on the right, of course, is going up. So you'll find in the report there are a number of highlights of some of the things that have happened at the impact and outcome level for UNICEF. I just want to pick up a couple for you, both the positives and the less positive. So one of the positives that we see is that 80% or more children from the poorest quintile are attending primary school, and that's increased by 10 percentage points since 2013. Another thing I think it's worth noting is that we're seeing that the percentage of education in global humanitarian funding has increased from an oft-touted just under 2%, 1.9% in 2013, to an estimated 3.6% in 2016, which I think is good news. I've already mentioned gender parity. A couple of areas I think we should look at in terms of less progress. We are seeing a stagnation in global pre-primary gross enrollment rates at about 41%. Majority of low-income countries are allocating less than 2% of their education budgets to pre-primary and are not adequately equipped to scale up. I was at the Global Partnership for Education Board last week, and this was something we discussed there as well. I think as we move forward with the SDGs, we of course have a commitment under the SDGs for at least 1 year of pre-primary, but we are not seeing the action in that area as much as we might be seeing the action at other parts of the system. So that for me is a bit of a concerning area. We should also note that gender parity in lower secondary, it marks both progress and regression. The percentage of countries with gender parity in gross enrollment has declined a little from the baseline of 38% to 35%, but it's important to realise that this masks some differences with the percentage of countries where girls are disadvantaged, and actually that number continues to decrease. So we're seeing more countries where gender parity is getting better for girls, but on the other side we're also seeing more countries where gender parity is getting worse for boys. So there are some differences that are worth noting there. We're also seeing a slight decrease in the percentage of countries dedicating at least 20% of their expenditure to education, from 20% in 2013 to 18% in 2016, marking potentially in some places a need to focus more on domestic expenditure, which we know is also one of the big findings from the Learning Commission report. Against all of the different program areas, I'm going to have to go this super quickly. A couple of highlights here. We're seeing many more examples of where parents and communities are getting very actively involved in early childhood education. We are seeing an increase, quite significant, in the number of countries that have policies and qualities around early learning programs, so these are all good things. But we did notice last year a 10% decrease in UNICEF spending on early learning programs. We're trying to understand why that is happening, because it's a bit of a red flag for us, given the fact that this is an area of concern globally. On learning, I think we're making good progress on supporting countries have well-functioning student learning assessment systems, which is a very important part of helping countries look at how they're going to approach learning. But obviously one of the most important things when you're doing learning is also looking at how teachers are using assessment to improve teaching. So we've popped up an example there of how that's happening in Afghanistan. One of the areas where, if you've read the Commission report, you can see enormous gains with regards to learning is around multilingual education, and this is, of course, something that UNICEF's worked on for a number of years. So we are seeing significant increases in the number of countries that are working on multilingual education, which is great. And one of the things I'm really excited about, and our advisor is smiling at me here, is that we now have tried and tested a new module for MIX, the household survey, which assesses reading and numeracy skills with children through a household survey, which means that it can reach children who are not in school, which makes it kind of special. So we're very excited about this, and we're hoping that we see an increase in the number of countries who take up the option of being able to do this module, because we think it will provide countries with really useful information on the status of learning of children in their countries, particularly the most marginalised children. In terms of equity, we see across our portfolio an increasing number of countries that are prioritising girls' education at secondary, going up to 33% of girls that have this as a recognised, targeted and budgeted priority. And there's a couple of examples out here. We've also done quite a significant amount of work this year on children with disabilities, and again, one of my advisors is at the back here who's been leading this, working with our disabilities people. We've rolled out technical advice. We've supported a number of countries on how they can better measure children with disabilities within the school system, but also again through the multiple indicator cluster survey, through the household survey, in terms of reaching those children, with disabilities in households, looking at both their child functioning and their access to education. Quickly focusing on education in emergencies, we launched Education Cannot Wait at the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016. UNICEF has been a key partner in taking this forward, as many of you probably know. Directly, we've supported 2.5 million children in Syria with education. We're also working at this sort of preventative side of actually helping many countries, not just countries in conflict, get better at risk-informed programming and preparedness. And then through the Peace Building Education and Advocacy Programme, we have generated, this is with support from the Netherlands, generated quite significant work on the contribution that education can make to peace and social cohesion, both at the country level and at the global public goods level. System strengthening is, of course, very important. Again, if you read the Education Commission report, you'll find really quite compelling evidence to show the importance of system strengthening when it comes to improving overall education performance for all children. UNICEF works with many partners in this respect. We don't work on these things alone, obviously, but some of the highlights include supporting sector-specific analysis in 17 countries. Something we think is being picked up in particular by the SDGs now is ways in which we can better measure equity in education index, and that's been rolled out in Nepal. We've also been part of the corporate-wide push within UNICEF to improve results-based management, so we've contributed to training there, and we've supported a number of countries I mentioned earlier in strengthening their education management information systems with a particular focus on children with disabilities. Partnerships, there are many. Just put those up there. Worth perhaps talking about, many of these you will obviously know, but the Humanitarian Education Accelerator has been quite an interesting one, because this is building on some of the work we've done in the last few years around innovation and how do you support innovation in education. This is a multi-stakeholder partnership that's really looking for innovations in the humanitarian space for education, and then helping those innovations move forward in terms of scaling up. Some of the lessons learned. As I said at the beginning, we mentioned briefly that we had looked at our overall portfolio from the lens of what does the Education Commission say works and doesn't work in education. We thought that was an interesting thing to look. So what you see at the left-hand side of this slide is the sort of five 4 areas where the Education Commission focuses on as being really important. So improving the performance of systems, innovation, inclusion and finance. And we looked at that and thought, well, where are we well aligned with what the Commission report says, and where might we want to do better? So the areas where we felt that we were very well aligned, I think system strengthening was one, obviously, the multilingual, bilingual education, our work on linking humanitarian and development, our focus on the hardest reach and the lowest performers, and our attempts within countries to really focus and target funding to the most marginalised. All felt they were very aligned with some of the lessons coming from the Commission. The areas where we thought we needed to push, and I've mentioned some of these already, obviously early learning is one, start early is one of the big lessons, and we need to make sure that we are increasing more on that. Learning itself, whilst I think this is something that we have done a lot more of, it's not an easy thing to do, so we need to keep making that shift and keep pushing on, are we helping children get results? And then part of that we felt is really focusing a little bit more, and this is something we're looking at moving forward with regards to teachers, the methods, what are teachers doing in classrooms and their effectiveness. Last year we spent 1.1 billion on education programming. That's 22% of UNICEF total resources. Sorry, this is all in the report. We saw an increase in emergency expenditure from 22% in 2014 to 36% in 2016. And as I mentioned earlier, we saw a slight decrease in early learning spending. We do have all of those figures in the report. I've even got a few more there. I think some of the things worth mentioning is really the value we see in the global thematic funding, which totaled, I think, 73.5 million in 2016. And it allows for things that perhaps the more earmarked funding doesn't allow for. Things like South-South cooperation is one. Examples like supporting curriculum reform in Kenya for inclusive education, or separate toilets for girls in Tunisia, or particularly the Gender Action Plan and a focus on 12 countries in particular, where these countries really want to focus on how can they help the most marginalised girls accelerate through education, or something like the Ungai Good Practice Fund, which provides global public goods on what really works in the area of global girls' education. Those are just a few examples of some of the things that we can do using thematic funds. And then lastly, looking at our future work plan, again, very difficult to do without the PowerPoint. And many of you will have seen where we're landing with the strategic plan. But we are looking particularly at considering to focus on girls and boys, particularly the most marginalised and those affected by humanitarian crises, being provided with inclusive and equitable education and learning opportunities. We are keen to make sure in our outputs that we're covering both early childhood through to adolescence, and that we're focusing on children with disabilities and minorities. We're looking to, as a second output area, increase learning outcomes for girls and boys. And then the area of which may be potential stretch for UNICEF is also to look at the skills, recognising that skills are developed throughout the education system, not just at the adolescent level, that are important for that, and that would cover skills for personal empowerment, skills for employment, skills for learning, and skills for employability.